Hi everyone, and welcome to this week's video. My name is Angel DeSantis. If this is your first video with me, welcome. I was born and raised in a cult called the Children of God, and I make these videos on religious trauma because even if you didn't grow up in a cult, some religious environments are actually incredibly abusive. And if you find yourself here, it's likely that there's something that is resonating with you, or you have maybe experienced religious abuse and are experiencing religious trauma. So I know that this is difficult stuff, and thank you for being here and for working on yourself. I'm going to look this way because my computer's here, but I received a question on Instagram from somebody who has also been through religious trauma, and they asked me if I could make a video on what healthy and real love looks like, because when you grow up in the church, and I don't know what your experience was, but in my experience, they always used love to attack and to defend abuse. So the cult that I grew up in was a terrible cult, as most cults are. But the leader was a pedophile, and what he said is that children love, like the way to love children is to like have sexual contact with them. And so for me, going through abuse as a child, it was done out of love. And then, um, so that just like, of course, jumbles up a lot of stuff that shouldn't be tied together. But I couldn't break it apart for a long time because in my head I was like, no, this is a loving thing. And because it's not violent, it must be okay. And I'm being told that I'm loved as this is happening. So I must be the problem, that I feel some type of way about it. And then later growing up, it's like, I say, well, this happened. And they say, well, forgive, like out of love for yourself and for others, you have to forgive. So that's like one aspect, one very terrible and abusive aspect that you might have experienced. And another aspect of it is using love to defend horrible behaviors and behavior that encroach on your boundaries. So, for example, I grew up communally, so I grew up in a house with a lot of people, or communes with a lot of people, and they would come take your stuff, or they would, use your car or use your camera, or in our case, like use your spouse for sex, and then say, well, out of love for me, you should let me do this. Like if you actually love your fellow man, or if you actually love the people around you, you should be okay with this. And if not, and you don't love me enough to let me like do this horrible behavior, then you are the problem and you are the sinner because you don't have enough love. And so love actually becomes synonymous with abuse. They mean the same thing. They don't actually mean love. They don't mean real love. And so coming out of that and then learning how to love was a very interesting thing, because first I have to let go of all my preconceived notion of what love is, because my idea of love was not at all what love was. So if you are here and you're watching this, I'm going to encourage you to make a note somewhere to take some time to think about how love was used for or against you. What is your view of love? And what is your view? How has your view of love affected your behavior with the people around you? And the important thing to listen for is whether or not love makes you have to shrink down and sell yourself short and not be honest about your needs. Is that something that you associate love with? It was definitely something that I did, and that was just an interesting thing to find out. But write down, one, what you think love is, or how love was used in the religion that you were in. And number two, do you associate love with having to shrink yourself to be smaller in order to be worthy of it? So that's the first part. The second part of it is an intimate relationship. So for me, I was married for a little while, and love always felt like a burden. And after leaving that marriage, I knew that I wanted to be alone for a little while, and I'm really glad that that I was able to do that, because I think when you grow up in an abusive religion, all of this stuff is so jumbled. You don't have a good relationship to yourself. You don't have a healthy relationship to love and intimacy. And so there is this moment where you need to pause and kind of reconstruct what all of these things are to you. So for me, when I first started dating again after coming out of a relationship, when somebody would tell me like, oh, I'm feeling love towards you, or oh, I'm having feelings about you, that for me was a huge red flag, because, again, because of how I had viewed love, love always meant that I would now be responsible to act a certain way to keep this person feeling a certain way. And I didn't want to be responsible for their life experience. So, because of that, I would just not have intimate relationships because I didn't want to be responsible for this other person. And for me, when I heard somebody loved me, I thought that they were trying to make a play for codependence and that they were trying to depend on me now. And I didn't want to be depended on because I had spent my whole life serving others, serving God, serving this cult, and I wanted to be done. So intimate relationships were really difficult for me because I didn't want them, because love still meant a burden to me. And I would have this even with intimate friendships. Friends would say, "Oh, you're so useful, and I love having you here in a crisis, and I need you, and I love you, and because I love you, therefore I need you, and that means you have to show up for me, otherwise you're hurting me." And again, that's an abusive setup where you have to serve this thing that's claiming to love you. And if you don't, then you are the bad thing. And for me, that just kept happening. That kept cycling in my life where I felt obligated to serve. And I would end up surrounded by people who claimed to love me and who just needed me as resource. And so I started going to therapy very regularly because I saw that pattern in my life and I was like, I want out. I don't want to feel that when somebody says they love me, it feels like I would actually rather die than have them love me. I don't want it. And if that's where you are, just understand that that's a very normal thing. You're definitely not the only one who goes through that. Um, and it is a normal thing when something has been used against you, when love has been used against you, and love is something that is thrown around so much. That word is everywhere. Um, it can be really, really confusing. And so I think it's important to stop and ask yourself what you think love is, or what your experience of love has been, and what you want that love to actually be, and what you want love to mean. So for me, in trying to cultivate healthy relationships, I really had to sit down and be like, what does it look like for me to love myself? Because again, if you don't know what the relationship is with yourself, then you will sell yourself short when it comes to relationship with others, and you will not be able to show up at 100% in relationship with others if you don't know how you give and receive self-care, or give and receive love, or give and receive communication. If you don't know what makes you expand or shrink, then when you enter a relationship, it'll be confusing for both parties, because what you are doing and what they are doing and your experience of each other is very different. And again, like for me, somebody would be wonderful to me and then tell me, hey, I'm starting to fall in love with you. And for me, my experience was, why did you mess this up? Like, we were having a good time, and now here come your feelings, and I'm out. Like, I don't want this at all. This is horrible. This feels like a burden. Like, goodbye, sir. And I understand that, like, now looking back, I'm like, oh, I'm the problem. But at the time, it truly felt like their love for me was the problem. But that, again, that tracks back to what my understanding of love was, and that I didn't have a good understanding of love, and I didn't have a good understanding of what was happening for me internally when somebody claimed to love me. So it all circles back to internal work. And it is important for you to show up and love yourself into existence. You absolutely have to love yourself into existence. And once you know what that's like, and again, I can only talk about it, my experience. So once I was able to fully love and communicate with myself and understand what was happening and understand that I could take breaks, now when I go into intimate relationship, it's very, very different. And I have a lot of respect for myself, for my boundaries, and for my need to communicate. And the other thing is that a lot of times in abusive religion, they tell you that love is the ability to stay in abusive relationships. So they use the word unity a lot. Like, we always had to have unity in our communes, and we always needed to love our neighbor. And that just meant you have to stay in something that is abusive and that you intensely dislike and that is actually killing you. And for me now, when I go into relationship, and if there's constantly conflict, and I had this recently last year where I just, every time I engaged with this person, there was conflict. There was always conflict. And I finally was like, I don't think I can do this constant conflict anymore. And I realized that the reason I was holding on to this relationship is I was taught that you need to show up, be in conflict, and you need to stay. And what I thought was, you know what? I don't like constantly being in conflict with this person. And for some reason, and I'm sure 50% of it is my fault and 50% of it is the other person's fault. But either way, I wanted to not be in conflict every time with this person. So I said, okay, I'm actually going to step away from this relationship because I feel like we're in conflict a lot. And they have the same background that I do. And so we were both used to having to stay in conflict. And their response was like, no, you're going to stay in this conflict with me. And I said, I absolutely will not, because I am no longer in that place. I don't have the burden of trying to be a good Christian woman. I don't have the burden of, if I don't get along with this person, I'm unloving and I'm going to hell. I needed to not be in this relationship. There was too much conflict for me. It was so stressful. And I realized that me constantly putting myself in the situation of conflict was me not serving myself well. So, out of love and respect for myself, and also love and respect for the other person, because I'm sure it wasn't great for them also to be in conflict, I excused myself from the relationship. And what that does is, again, it creates a space for me to sit still and kind of observe what happened. What can I take responsibility for? How does this clarify my view of love? And how can I move forward into the world? Um, so, if you are in that place where you've come out from um, some sort of abusive religion, and you have a lot of feelings around love, and you associate love with having to serve at your own expense, um, just know that, first of all, you're not alone. I'm here with you. And secondly, that that's a normal thing to do. That is a normal part of human development. And if you are here and you're experiencing that, that's good. That means you're developing. That means you're starting to become aware of something that you no longer want. And now you know you can make a decision for something else. And I think it's really important in every single relationship, not even romantic relationships, totally aside, just in any relationship, you should feel like you are able to show up as yourself. There should be no second guessing. Should I not say this? Should I do that? Or people looking at me weird? Or, there should be no shrinking yourself down in order to exist safely in a space. If you do feel the need to shrink yourself down in order to oh my God, exist safely, then that is not a good relationship or situation for you to be in. I'm going to try and say it again and not stutter. If you have to shrink yourself down in order to exist in a situation safely, that's not a good situation for you. And you always deserve safety in every single relationship. You deserve to be seen and heard. And sometimes you won't feel that in relationships. And if you don't, it's important for you to take yourself out of that and think about what you can grow from. How can you love yourself? How can you show up? And also understand that not every relationship is for you. The relationships that you have now ebb and flow, things change. And I understand that it's painful to lose relationships, especially ones that you've been in for a longer period of time, but also the ones you've been in for a longer period of time, especially when you come from an abusive past. Maybe the relationships that you cultivate when you came from an abusive past, maybe now you've outgrown them. And that's a real possibility. And again, even though it is a painful situation, it is still a good sign that you are outgrowing relationships that you started when you were back in an abusive pattern, and that was your view of love. So I really encourage you to continue to evolve your idea of what love is, and you should absolutely feel supported and upheld, and like you can expand around the people who claim to love you. That is really, really important. And know that this takes time. Time is an ingredient. I got that from a bread book. But time is an ingredient in your life, in your relationships, and in your view of love. So I hope that this was helpful. And again, the 2 points, or the couple of points that I'm just going to try and wrap up, is to think about what your view of love is. Does love feel like a burden? And also, what would you like love to be for you? Also, really take time to get to know how to love yourself, and know that you deserve to feel safe and you deserve to expand around the people who claim to love you. So I hope that this was helpful. Again, you're not alone in the journey. And ask me questions if you have them. I will link things or leave things below that I think will be useful. But I appreciate you guys being here. I really do. And I will see you next week.